document at Cambridge University, one of the greatest research universities in the world. Their library has the greatest collection that basically there is. And their oldest written document that they have is the Sumerian clay tablet, which dates 2200 BCE. And what it basically is a receipt for lard.
Oh.
The oldest written document. And it refers to 22 jars of lard. Each of those jars believed to be about 80 liters of lard, or about 50 pounds or so. That's a lot of lard.
What kind of lard would have been produced in that time? Ox lard?
No, it's sheep, or actually, well, lard actually technically was pigs, so it's probably pork at this point. So the Chinese developed pork back there. But the invention of butter, 10,000 BCE. Olives were first pressed for oil, 6,000 BCE. Deep frying, invented by the Egyptians around 5,000 BCE. And they were actually using palm oil. Mesopotamians invented copper frying pan, palm oil. We go forward and forward, but for thousands of years, you see all these early dates going back to 1879. So from about 500 BCE, I can put a lot more information about the fats and its importance. But fat was absolutely critical, because not only did we use it for our cooking purposes, for frying, for baking, and all that other sort of stuff, but it was also our source of light. Tallow candles was the #1 source of light. Yes, you had honey wax candles, but those were actually very expensive and most often just used for churches and the royalty because they're so expensive. You could burn olive oil.
BCE is before Christ, what?
Before Common Era. So that's how the historians refer to it. So before Common Era, and then CE is Common Era. It's not until 1879 when Edison finishes the invention of the light bulb and we start beginning to switch over to electricity that we're not even burning tallow candles, but we use it in everything. We use it for our lubrication and stuff. In fact, during World War II, we're going to have a shortage of lard and tallow, and they were telling people, save your fats, because we actually needed them to lubricate the machinery of war. All the modern petrochemical lubricants and stuff aren't even going to show up till the 20th century. You lubricate it with tallow and lard.
Is that a highly purified style fat or a highly condensed fat?
Well, it depends on how you purify it. So a lot of the stuff would have been rendered and wouldn't be as pure as the stuff that we produce industrially now, but it still would have been pretty good.
It would have been lower class?
Well, it wouldn't have been deodorized. It would have had more odor, a little more color, and that sort of stuff.
So the first thing was butter, and then it went to olive oil.
Well, no, lard actually would have been, but just that we know that butter was invented about 10,000 BC, but animal fats.
That's the oldest, right? And then
when that thing, but the fats go way back. Like I said, human beings evolved eating fat. That's how our brains got so bad. It's the only big source of calories that there is. Protein doesn't provide the same amount of calories, carbohydrates don't. So for us to evolve the way we did, we had to hunt for fat. We were fat hunters. And then of course we want to talk about the science. And so basically this is a triglyceride molecule. 3 fatty acid molecules connected by a glycerol molecule. And this is what makes up most of our fats. And there's a huge amount of chemistry here. And I don't want to go into all that chemistry very much, but it's very important, I think, for chefs to begin to understand some of the things. For example, so this is a triglyceride where we have 1 glycerol molecule right here, and then our 3 fatty acids. But there's also diglycerides and monoglycerides, where there's only 1 fatty acid attached. And guess what? Those also play an incredibly important role in our cooking process. Probably the most famous of all the diglycerides is lecithin. It's an emulsifier. Monoglycerides, also emulsifiers. And
What's
stuff
the general
like that.
source for that?
Lecithin, eggs. Although we get soy lecithin now for all you vegan and vegetarians out there. But the thing is to remember, there are actually 3 types of fat: saturated fats, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. At the top we have a saturated fat, and this is palmitic acid, 16 carbon chain acid. This is stearic acid, an 18 carbon chain acid, and as you can see, it's a fully saturated fat, meaning every carbon molecule has 2 hydrogen molecules attached to it. Notice how beautifully straight it is. So it's very resistant to degradation, to breaking down, and that sort of stuff. But it also means that scientifically, when a saturated fat cools down, it crystallizes much easier because of its regularity. We're going to teach the gospel of fats in 4 sermons. Praise the Lord, ladies and gentlemen. We'll talk about the early history of fat, the science of fat, but do not worry, I will go through it very briefly. If you have a lot of more detailed questions, I will answer them later. But it's important to know a little bit of the science. We're talking about recent history of fat. I'm talking the early 20th century to the present day. Wow, that really took fast.
Wow, good.
That really went fast.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's talk about the early history of fat. You see, the early history of fat is very, very important. You see, life as we know it would not be here without fat. Multicellular life requires fat. Cellular life itself. So we have all these chemicals for life floating around into that great vat ocean and stuff like that. For them to actually become efficient, to match and meet with each other, to begin to become much more effective at the part of evolution, we have to distinguish what is not the animal from the outside world instead of just being one big ocean. It's not even clear that we'd be anything but one single organism were it not for the addition of fat. Why? Because fat, lipids in the technical terms, are what create the boundaries of life. It is what creates the membranes that separate the cell and the interior parts from the cell. It is lipids. It is fat. There would be no multicellular life were it not for fat. Ladies and gentlemen, that tells you how very important it is to all of us today. And human biology. You see, human beings, we can talk about evolution and stuff like that. Human beings, well, we're not really good at being plant eaters. And if we were plant eaters, it would be absolutely horrible for us because we'd have to spend most of our time, gorillas, which are vegetarians, spend up to half their day simply chewing and digesting their food because they have to get the nutrients from those raw plants and stuff like that. We are not designed to be herbivores. Our guts are not long enough. We couldn't actually get the nutrition as easily as we do if we were herbivores. And we're not particularly well suited to be carnivores either. Our livers aren't big enough. So although we're highly adaptable and you can be vegan and you can be a 100% carnivore and do well, we're omnivores. But the thing is, calories are hard. It's not until the industrial age that calories become a lot easier for us to get, and then we get a little too many calories and everything like that. But so what our ancestors searched for, what our ancestors wanted was really great source of calories. Why? Our brains, those big brains of ours, they take 25 to 30% of all the calories burned in our body. And by the way, those brains, it's mostly cholesterol and fat. So we were fat hunters. That's what human beings
That's a
were.
good point. So you're trying to say the smartest people in the world eat a lot of fat.
Absolutely. Okay? And it becomes very important to our culture. Food is never just food. There are many ways that we get culture. Music, art, science, literature. There's only one type of culture we get every day, and that is food culture. You tell me what you eat, and I will tell you where you are from. And fat plays a huge role in our culture because it was so energy dense. This is what people favored. When the Greeks sacrificed to the gods, they sacrificed the fatty cuts of the meats, which actually ended up in the priest's belly. Okay?
I eat a lot of fats. Can you tell me where I'm coming from?
Actually, I'm probably sure it's sugar. Actually,
And I'm bald too. Yeah.
Well, that's a whole other story.
I'm from Sherwood, Florida.
That might be like a northeast, west, south thing.
But we anoint with oil. We sacrifice with ghee. The miracle of Hanukkah and the oil lamps, and of course, Fat Tuesday. Right before Lent, when we celebrate, it's part of our culture and it's part of our language. We chew the fat, butter you up, large one, pros, cream of the crop, fat and happy, all these other things. It's part of our culture. Fat, very important, and it goes way back into our history. This, ladies and gentlemen, is lard and tallow. The next fat, this is oleic acid. This is a monounsaturated fat, meaning that it's missing one hydrogen molecule and thus having a double bond with the carbon chain right here. You can see a nice double bond there. This gives it a slight curvature, but not too much. And what this also does is this means that it's not quite as resistant, but this is oleic acid. This is an 18 carbon chain. All these models are 18 carbon chain. This is olive oil. Olives are about 75% oleic acid. So this is the fat that everybody loves. Monounsaturated oleic acid. And then, of course, we have polyunsaturates, where there are multiple hydrogen atoms missing. Now, this is going to do a couple of different things. This is going to make the chemical bonds very curvy. So this is alpha-linoleic acid, and it's quite curvy. This means that it's going to break down. This is actually an omega-3 fatty acid, one of the good ones, 18 carbon chains. Very curvy. It doesn't crystallize very easily, which is why it remains an oil. See, an oil is a fat that is liquid at room temperature, and it takes a lot to make this crystallize, whereas a saturated fat, tallow with lots of stearic acid in it is a solid to 105 to 110 degrees, but very, very curvy. But it's also very subject to degradation. Now the other thing is, Notice where the hydrogen atoms are on this. Going a little to the science. We have our double bond, and we have the hydrogen atoms on the same side of the double bond. That's called a cis fat, and this is most of our naturally occurring fats, which gets us to the idea of trans fatty acids. And a trans fatty acid, the hydrogen bond is on the opposite sides of the double carbon bond. So this is conjugated linoleic acid, and this is both cis and trans, and it's one of the only most commonly occurring natural trans fatty acids. So here we have a cis bond with the hydrogen atoms on both sides of the carbon bond, and then we have our trans bond here where the hydrogen atoms on the other side. And this can be very important. This makes it a trans fatty acid, one of the only naturally occurring trans fatty acids. CLA, which is also considered very healthy. Okay, I can go in more depth.
So, olive oil is in the middle.
Yes, oleic acid.
The first one that you brought up was the,
Stearic acid.
that's
Like lard.
like lard.
Right. Well, so we're going to talk about that. So stearic acid is saturated fat,
That's true.
and it gets its name from cattle.
What you're saying is, what you're showing me here is that the lard, it actually carries some of the best, not minerals, but the best characteristics out of oils, even over olive oil.
Well, I would argue yes, but monounsaturated fats play an important role.
Yeah, it's always balance. I mean, balance is always going to be important. But you're kind of going back to what we kind of do back in the old days, which is that lard is not what we thought it was, or have the deterioration on our bodies that we thought it did.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that to open back up your mind. Wow, you got a heavy job ahead of you.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. The other thing to notice about the trans fatty acids is, so even though this is has multiple missing hydrogens, it's still pretty straight because of the trans fat, which means that this also crystallizes. That's how we get solidified trans fats, which we'll talk about in a second. So again, there's more to this, but I don't want to bore you with all the science. There's a lot more to it, but just give you some idea so you can think about what is a saturated fat, what is a mono, what is a polyunsaturated, and what do they do. All fats are mixed when they come in their natural state, okay? So butter, saturated fat, 62%. It has more saturated fat than anything else.
Love it.
Monounsaturated, very low in polyunsaturated. Butter also very interesting because in its normal state, unless it's ghee, it's gonna have 10 to 15% water, which also changes the way it operates and things. But all of these, just give an example. So beef, that's our tallow, 50% saturated, 42 monounsaturated, mostly oleic acid, very low in the polyunsaturated, very solid, very resistant to degradation and breaking down.
That's
why
why
it's
it
so
becomes
great.
more healthy, right?
That's one of the things that's very healthy for it. When you talk about it, the stearic acid, for example, hasn't been shown to cause any problems. It's palmitic acid that may cause problems, we're not sure. And pork, I want to point this out, pork is actually more monounsaturated fat than saturated fat. Pork actually is more oleic acid than saturated fat. So pork is the olive oil of fats. And then you can see things like schmaltz, which is very soft because it has much higher polyunsaturated fat content. We have coconut, olive, there's our high monounsaturated. Soybean oil, incredibly high on the polyunsaturated, which is one of the problems that we're beginning to see. And then tuna. And the reason I break this down here is we have tuna saturated fat, polyunsaturated. We can categorize fats in a variety of different ways. So there are the animal fats, fish fats, tropical fats. That is palm and coconut. Fruit fats, that is avocado and olive. And then there are seed oils, which are your soybeans. And they have different characteristics. Note, the tropical fats, like coconut and palm, have very high saturated fat content. That has to do with the natural temperatures that they evolved in. You have to have a higher saturated fat content so that the fat isn't fully liquid at room temperature. When you're in the tropics, it's very hot, so you have to have a higher saturated fat content. If you're in a colder climate, then the fruits and stuff like olives and things are going to have a higher monounsaturated fat content than saturated. Again, having to do with their temperature, which is why, for example, tuna has a very low saturated fat content compared to polyunsaturated. Why? Well, because they're cold water and they live in cold water. They're cold-blooded and they live in cold water. If they had a high saturated fat content, they crystallize up. Whereas beef, which are warm-blooded and of course have a high volume to mass ratio, volume to surface ratio, they're hot. So they have to have a higher saturated fat content. Not quite as hot as coconuts in the tropics, but so there's science behind this. And again, I can go in more detail and explain.
Levels of saturated fat.
Yes, it's going to vary slightly between different breeds and stuff like that, but not a huge amount.
Okay.
It's not going to be dramatic.
And also where it is in the On the outside, it's softer. On the inside, where there's internal fat, that's harder, right?
Absolutely, and the reason for that is because internally, that's where the heat is, whereas the external, it's a little colder, and so the fat's softer. Again, there's science behind it. There's a reason why we have different fat contents in our different ingredients. But going to the early 20th century, so we didn't really talk about vegetable oils too much, and here's the reason why. Vegetable oils aren't going to be invented until the late 1800s. And the very first vegetable shortening, Crisco, is going to be invented in 1911. So all these vegetable oils that we've all been cooking with, the canolas, the soys, the corn oils, cottonseed oil is going to be invented in the 1800s. Everything else, practically everything else, 20th century. And the first solid shortening, 1911. Crisco was designed to mimic lard and be cheaper. That was the whole point. And the way they did it was the invention of the partial hydrogenation process, where they take a polyunsaturated fat, and then with a nickel catalyzer and the injection of hydrogen, they create a trans fat, which is not natural. With the exception of conjugated linoleic acid, trans fats aren't natural.
Gee, you mean like sweetener?
Yeah. So, yeah, it was invented in 1911. So I love this. Crisco, by the way, stands for crystallized cottonseed oil. They were using cottonseed oil because cottonseed oil was cheap. It was a waste byproduct of the cotton industry. And so they was extremely cheap, and so they could get lower price than lard. Lard was more expensive. Nowadays we think lard's inexpensive and cheap, but back then you had to use it for everything. Anything. The only fats you used for baking were tallow, lard, and butter. That was it. Butter's always been very expensive, and lard was the used. So when Crisco comes out, it's extremely cheap. It's also vegetarian, which is going to be useful for some people, and then it's also kosher, which is useful for another group of folks. Great marketing and stuff like that, but I love that it's digestible. That's going to be problematic. Because again, the trans fats, which we discovered, are going to be very, very unhealthy for us. So then we have the arrival of these modern industrial, factory-derived fats from vegetable oils, and then saturated fats get harshed on. This is physiologist Ansel Keys, and he did a lot of studies, starvation studies in World War II and stuff like that. And what they discovered was that middle-aged white men were dying a lot of heart disease in the 20th century. They're trying to figure out what it was. And Ansel Keys had the hypothesis, what's called the diet heart hypothesis, that we were eating too much red meat, too many saturated fats, clogging our arteries, and giving us all heart attacks. And then he did the 7-country study where he looked at countries where they didn't eat a lot of red meat, like say Japan, and their incidence of heart attacks was lower, and all this other stuff. A lot of problems with this research, a ton of problems with this research, but it kind of makes sense from an intuitive point of view, even though that's not the way our bodies work, it turns out. But he also was one of the founders of the American Heart Association, one of the leaders. And so he got the American Heart Association to say, hey. So the American Heart Association, and ever since then, the American Heart Association said, stay away from the fats, stay away from the saturated fats. They convinced the USDA. So the first food pyramid published in 1992. Now the USDA has been making dietary guideline recommendations from 1980. And starting in 1980, they started saying no fats. And if you look at the original food pyramid, a lot of us would think this is crazy. Fats, oils, and sweets used sparingly, like the less fat you use, the better, right? And then tons of carbs. I remember when, the food pyramid, I actually tried to follow this stuff, and sometimes I better have an extra piece of bread with this meal so I can have all my servings of bread that the USDA recommends and stuff like that. And nowadays, that's kind of wacko.
It's upside down already.
Anyway, but things have changed. So this is the actual changing guidelines, and it just shows you how much the USDA was saying, get rid of the fat. And they were saying, 20% fat, even lower. No fat in the 90s and early 2000s. The fat was the evil thing. The cholesterol fat, again, keeping it extremely low even to today. But I want to notice a couple things. We realized that doesn't actually work. So in 2015, the last time they updated it, no upper limit on the amount of fat in your diet. Now they still say stay away from the saturates. The saturated fat, go with the monounsaturated fat or the polyunsaturated fat, but fat's not a problem. The other thing you may remember this is cholesterol, because cholesterol, that's what's clogging our arteries and stuff. Don't eat the cholesterol, don't eat the cholesterol, don't eat the eggs. If you're gonna eat eggs, eat only egg whites, because that's just protein and there's no cholesterol in it.
Couldn't find out that wasn't right.
Wasn't right. Turns out our dietary cholesterol, the cholesterol you eat, doesn't affect what our body creates. Our body creates all that cholesterol. Yeah, and It doesn't work.
funded by a certain.
Americans continue to get, although Americans haven't obviously completely followed the guidelines the exact way the USDA would want them to and everything like that, we have reduced our saturated fat content intake. We have reduced our cholesterol intake and stuff. And guess what? We're getting fatter, we're getting more diabetes, we're having more heart attacks.
Yeah,
We're just about the same heart attacks. It didn't work. And we came up with some weird stuff. Fat was so evil, we had to have no fat stuff. So the invention of Olestra, which is which brought the,
We don't even know the effects of that yet.
well,
You don't need
well, here's the
facts
thing: with
that
nobody
you
sells
vote
it
with that.
anymore because Olestra. One of the side effects is what is called anal leakage, and that term became very popular when those first came out and stuff like that.
I do remember that. I do recall something like that.
Yeah, well, they don't sell them anymore. It had to be on the warning label and stuff. Also, it stripped your body of the fat-soluble vitamins, so they had to fortify the Olestra stuff because all the a lot of the vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin K, vitamin D, vitamin E, all come through fat. And so, yeah, not so good. And then snack rolls. So these are fat-free cookies and stuff like that. But what turns out is that these things are so packed with carbohydrates and sugar, they have more calories than the fat versions. And they just don't taste as good because they have to be manipulated and stuff like that. It turns out the carbohydrates are a fairly big problem. The sugars are a fairly big problem. Nutritional complexity. Nutrition is hard. The nutrition that we need changes. What you need as an infant is different than what you need as a young child. It's different than you need during puberty, young adulthood, and then when you get like me, old. Your diet has to change. But we're finding out from various researchers and journalists and things like Gary Taubes, Good Calories, Bad Calories, The Big Fat Surprise, is that it's complex. There is no one diet size fits all. Human beings are amazingly diverse. History proves that. We have, for example, the Inuit, the Native Americans of the far north, okay, surviving for months at a time on diets that were 70% fat because they're eating blubber and stuff like that. Certain cattlemen in Africa who ate tons of fat and milk, tons of saturated fats, very few vegetables and things on the one hand. Now we haven't had any truly Native American tribes that were 100% vegetarian, but those that ate low vegetarian, they also thrived, they also multiplied and stuff like that. So human beings can survive on a varied diet.
I'm sure in the right scenario that's fine too.
Exactly. So, but it's complex. There's no one diet fits all for all age groups at all times. But saturated fat is not the enemy. Saturated fat is not the demon that everybody thought it was. In fact, certain things. So this is our stearic acid. Turns out it doesn't raise the bad cholesterol. It lowers the good cholesterol. But here's the other thing. You never just eat pure stearic acid. It's always going to be mixed with others like palmitic acid and some of these other things. And it's going to be an ingredient. You're not going to sit there eating spoonfuls of tallow at a time. Okay? Well, good for you if you want to do that, but I'm not going to, this is not the way it works. You're going to be eating it in combination with other foods.
What kind of fats do we mostly find in sauces and dressings and things like this? What is that?
So that's mostly going to be our vegetable oils in most sauces and dressings nowadays.
Which are still considered to be somewhat healthy.
That's what they say, but there's a lot of problems with polyunsaturates. We're probably eating too many polyunsaturates. In the natural world, polyunsaturates are relatively uncommon compared to the other stuff. Our ancestors were not eating seed oils. They're eating fruit oils that are high in monounsaturates, like olive oil. They're eating palm oil, which is high in, the only seed oils they were eating were things like sesame oil. But sesame oil, again, they'd be using that as a flavoring, not as a primary element of their diet.
It was a finishing oil.
It was a finishing oil. So it's not something they would be using it for everything, deep frying it. You would not deep fry in sesame oil, it's too hard. Because before, the reason the seed oils actually get developed is industrialization. In order to take these little seeds and crush them between steel rollers and extract the oil from them using solvents like benzene, which is how most seed oils are extracted, we couldn't do that before the industrial age. We didn't, so when we made sesame oil, it was made by hand and hand presses and stuff, so it was a very inefficient process.
Fries don't taste the same.
And they don't taste the same.
They're not good.
Yep.
I don't want any. It doesn't taste like the McDonald's I remember.
It's flavorful.
Hell no.
So the animal
Fries that McDonald's used to make when they cook with lard,
It's not supposed to be too.
When you're drunk and you wanna go and have something after hours,
Tallow, that was their.
a little bit of salt made a big difference.
We
They don't
had
taste
some
anywhere
amazing-
close to this thing.
What did you have then?
Oh, we had a fry presentation, we tried tallow and
Oh, man,
lard
I
and
missed
soybean
that.
oil, and
I
then
missed that
tallow
one.
and the lard were amazing.
Well, so flavor. I mean, one of the things I always say about vegetable oils is that vegetable oils, taste the food, not the fat. Well, here's the thing: we're chefs, so when you cook with fats become part of the ingredient. You cook with butter because it tastes good. Okay, when your choice is neutral flavored canola or butter, which one do you want to put in there? You want to put in the butter because it's going to improve the flavor. Actual fats bring umami to the plate. Okay, they make things taste more of themselves. French fries taste more like a French fry, like a potato. Fried chicken, fried in lard or tallow, tastes more like fried chicken. Now that may seem counterintuitive, but again, umami enhances the existing flavors of the product, making them taste more of themselves. You know who uses tallow for frying their chicken?
No.
Buffalo Wild Wings,
Uh,
Popeyes.
The flavors are way better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And here's the thing: you ever try to make a chateau potato or a souffle potato in oil that's not lard? It doesn't come out the
Doesn't
same.
taste the same.
Julia Child swore by lard and tallow. She knew what she was doing.
She died by lard.
Hey,
That's the same thing when we talk about MSG. A lot of the Asians think, "I don't know what your problem is with MSG."
There's no problem with MSG, honestly. But this is a way to enhance the flavors. So, for example, when they say these neutral oils, these neutral vegetable oils, the reason they're neutral is because they have to strip all the flavor from them. They have to strip all the flavor for them because in their natural state, they're bitter, nasty, and things like cottonseed oil actually contain toxins. If you didn't process cottonseed oil, it's poisonous.
I want some of this, right?
So, a bunch of other things.
But be careful, you might like it.
The animal fats are natural. The way we make animal fats is we take the trim fat from the animals, we grind it, we boil it, we centrifuge it to remove the water and oil, separate them, and boom, that's what we have. So it's a physical process. Whereas to get seed oils, you have to have chemical extraction, chemical refining, degumming, bleaching, all these other things in order to turn these things into. No, it's more like the chicken fat. So it's a
30,
but it
40.
is higher in saturated fat. And why is it higher in saturated fat? Because ducks are going to be migrating and stuff, and they're in colder environments. So they're not as high in saturated fat as say pork or.
Because duck fat
cattle.
is very popular for making a lot of things.
Oh, absolutely! It just improves the flavor. I mean, you don't see people going out, we fry our French fries in canola or soy. But you are seeing more restaurants that are saying we fry in duck fat, we fry beef tallow, and that sort of stuff. Turn off that one.
Is it illegal to fry still beef?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Again, no, Popeyes fries in beef tallow, Buffalo Wild Wings fries in beef tallow, top round roast beef, smash burgers, Checkers and Rallies, beef tallow.
And you can buy that in liquid format now too, right?
They do liquid blends, but in order to make it liquid, you have to add vegetable oil to it, a high
So you want to
polyunsaturated.
start with a solid.
You want to start with the solids, and that's gonna do your best frying. Again, because it's
Put
so.
that back in my fryer later, if I went that way in the hospital. Yeah. You think, well, no, because you're talking about everything we've pretty much been taught all our lives is wrong.
Right.
So you're talking about coming back another, 180 degrees.
Now, when you go to veg oil versus animal fats, the veg oil sucks itself into the thing
Item.
of frying. The beef fat
Doesn't.
reduces.
So you actually consume less oil.
Actually, you actually do. So like a donut, a fried donut, once it's done, is actually about 30% of the calories in a fried donut actually come from the oil that it's fried in. If it's veg oil, if it's animal protein, then we're talking 20 to 25% because there's less absorbency. It's crisper. There's less weeping. So when you take something that's been fried and you put it on a piece of paper or cardboard, and then you see how the cardboard gets the oil and stuff like that. If you were to do that side-by-side test with something fried in beef tallow versus something fried in vegetable oil, you would see that the weeping from the vegetable oil is much greater. And that's why they taste greasy, and that's why they get soggy.
How official is this knowledge that you're providing us today? on what ground do we have to stand on?
Now, as far as the health claims and stuff, that's extremely complicated. And again, there's a lot of people.
Yeah, but if you're not sucking the oil into the product that you're frying,
Mhm.
when somebody consumes it, they're not gonna be
So
consuming.
he's just
as
saying
much
it
oil.
sucks in 10% less, right?
Yeah.
Not that it's not
Well,
getting
5
sucked
to
in,
10% less.
which is like not that much.
But
The
It's
difference,
still,
right?
it's,
But it's something.
yes.
When you're talking about the average person that has fries how many times a week?
Probably a couple more than a couple. Yeah.
But you have to remember,
Or potato, or whatever the case may be.
Right.
I know that's why a lot of people are just, I'm cooking a lot and roasting a lot of stuff now in my pork fats and just saving my beef fats from cooking. I'm not per se using a lot of tallow, but I'm just, I'm using, whatever lards I have left over from my cooking.
Well, and that's where your great grandma used to cook. She
Yeah.
kept that coffee can
Yeah.
of fats next to the stove, and that's where she put all the drippings and the bacon grease
Yeah.
and everything, and then spoonful into the pan. So they didn't put a glug of oil, the spoonful of that solid fat in the pan. That's why the pancakes were so good, and the eggs, fried eggs, were so darn good. And again, it's going to vary depending on the product. So actually, French fries, the absorbency of French fries is actually fairly small. Compared to say donuts. So donut is like 30% fat after it's fried because it gets a lot of absorbency.
Think about that.
Where French fry is actually somewhere between 5 and 10% oil.
Fried chicken.
And fried chicken's going to be in the middle. So that's going to be like maybe 10 to 15%. Again, depending on the breading and stuff like
Fish.
that.
Yeah, I like it better.
Yeah, there's a number of different factors, but again, so it varies quite a lot. So
Does
it's like
lard operate at 350 degrees pretty much all the time too?
oh, absolutely. So actually, the animal fats, again, because they're saturated fats, have a much higher smoke point than most of your polyunsaturated. So 450 degrees, easy.
Technically, I could get a longer longevity. Like I was always taught with canola oil. Canola oil, you get a week out of this oil in certain cases or whatever.
Actually creating a type of plastic. All plastics are actually created from fats, but usually most of our plastics are made from fats that don't exist in nature because they're coming out of petrochemicals and stuff like that, not edible fats. But technically you can make plastics out of edible fats. But it naturally occurs, and that's that stuff that's really hard to clean off. You get a lot more of that. You get 7-8 times more of that polymerization with polyunsaturates than you do with saturated fat. And so it's much more resistant, it's gonna last much longer. The only way they can get vegetable oils to become more stable is to increase the amount of saturation, either through using fully hydrogenated fats. There's a difference between partial hydrogenated and fully hydrogenated. Fully hydrogenated fats are not dangerous. They're just really expensive to make, which is why they didn't do it. But now they're doing it because they can't make the partially hydrogenated legally. Or using high oleic. So you hear a lot of high oleic soybean oil, high oleic canola oil. Well, oleic acid is a monounsaturated fat, and monounsaturated fats are not as stable as saturated fats, but they're much more stable than polyunsaturated fats. And so a high oleic canola oil is more stable than just regular canola oil. It's complicated, but guess what? You're paying a lot of money for that GMO product. So, but the heritage cooking fats are natural. They're also authentic and nostalgic, okay? This is what we cooked with for thousands of years, most recipes. So when you think about frying, when you think about the Italians making cannoli, fried cannoli, right? Well, what were they frying it in? They weren't frying it in olive oil, they were frying it in lard. Olive oil is too expensive to fry with, okay? You can fry with it, and there's some things that they did fry with it, but generally, for most frying applications, it was lard. What did the original fish and chips in Britain were fried with? Beef tallow.
I just had some fish and chips the other on a trip I had, and it was the best fish and chips, and I'm pretty sure they fried in lard because it was the best I've ever had.
Well, fish tacos were from Mexico, right? They were frying in lard. What did they fry churros in? Lard. The very first reference to donuts in a book, they referenced it to it being fried in lard. Okay, because remember there wasn't anything else. And again, olive oil would have been way too expensive for frying purposes. So we're using these beef fats, it's authentic, gives you the flavor. I mean, when you go to the Mexican restaurant, you want to have corn chips with your salsa, those corn chips are just going to taste so much better fried in traditional lard. It's sustainable. So a cow, only about 40% of a cow that's slaughtered by weight makes it onto the plate. Hamburgers, steaks, that sort of thing, right? Now, we use a lot of the other cow as well, so it doesn't go to waste. Obviously, the skin becomes leather, the bones get boiled down into gelatin and stuff like that. But we have what's called 12% fat trim. And so the fat trim is what Coast Packing takes and renders it into tallow. So if you're selling burgers and you're selling steaks and you're not using that fat trim, if you're not cooking with beef fat, you're wasting part of the cow. We talk about nose to tail eating. We talk about sustainability. So what are you going to do? You're going to chop down another acre of rainforest to make more palm oil? Or are you going to use the fat that's already you're using because you're making hamburgers already? And it's health. So we talked about health, but people are realizing fat isn't scary anymore. The most popular diet, so a recent study came out just a week ago. 16% of Americans are on a low carbohydrate diet. And if you're on a low carbohydrate diet, where are you getting your calories from? Protein, but there's only so much protein you can eat, and fat. Okay? Keto, 0 carbs basically. Paleo, ZC, 0 carb, low carb, high fat. Atkins, all of these things are not saying don't fear the fat. I mean, Atkins famous for, fry your bacon and butter. Just don't have a muffin with your bacon. Just have your eggs and no egg McMuffin. Forget the muffin part. So health, people aren't afraid of it becoming, so fat is back. Anyway, I'm biased to a certain extent. Okay, so I'm the corporate chef for Coast Packing Company, 96-year-old, family owned and managed, 4th generation. This is the 3rd generation right here. 4th generation is my boss. He's not here today. But what I like to say is that Coast Packing, I don't like fat because Coast Packing hired me. Coast Packing hired me because I like fat. So, if you guys have any questions, just let me know.
So what should I fry my Thanksgiving turkey in?
Tallow or lard. And as a matter of fact, I actually fried a turkey